Great. Well, thank you so much to Ron and David for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here with all of you. And so, yeah, I'd like to just launch into it. Today's talk is going to focus on some fairly recent work that my group has been doing over the past few years. I should say my lab is probably better known for our work on spike train analysis. So a lot of the work that I did during my PhD and my postdoc and my early days as a faculty member were focused on statistical models for quantifying spike train and the information carried by spike trains. But in the past few years, we got interested in understanding decision-making behavior. And so today's talk will have no neural data. We'll focus only on various models and theoretical analyses of behavior. So the motivating question for this talk, I want you to think about are what are the factors that govern learning? So how is it that we can take an animal who doesn't know how to perform a task and teach them to do a task that they've never seen before? In fact, in many cases, it will be a task that's quite unnatural that an animal wouldn't do in the wild. And it turns out that in order to solve this task, we're going to break it down into three subparts, three goals, all right? And so these goals will actually be the outline for the different parts of the talk. So each one will focus on a different goal, all right? So the first goal we can consider is that of tracking the state of learning over time. If we want to understand how animals learn, we want to know the current policy or their current, what do they learn so far, I guess. Secondly, then we'd like to know, well, what is the learning rule that governs their behavioral change? So in each trial, they may get rewarded or they may get punished. How does that punishment or reward translate into a new policy? All right, so that's inferring the learning rule from data. And then lastly, if we have the animal's learning rule and its current state of knowledge, how can we optimize training to speed up the learning process? So that's the high-level outline of the talk that I'll give you today. And before I dive into it, I just want to give you a little bit of motivation. So all of this work was actually inspired by a talk that I heard by Athena Akrami, who was then a postdoc in Carlos Brody's lab at Princeton. She was presenting about the work that went on to become this Nature paper about how animals can perform a parametric working memory task. And so she started out her talk with a description of the task, which is a simple two-tone discrimination task. So the animal will receive two tones. There's a stimulus A and a stimulus B with a delay in between. And then they have to decide which of those tones is louder, all right, in order to make a binary decision left or right. So if they hear bop, bop, they should turn left. And if they hear bop, bop, turn right. All right, so it's a fairly simple task. That's one bit of information. Is A larger than B or vice versa? And then she showed us the learning curves for her data for this task. And it turned out that rats took, on average, 3 months to learn this task. This is a plot of the animal's percent correct as a function of the number of sessions. And you can see the average animal takes around 90 sessions. So nearly 3 months of time to learn to perform this task. And so I was sitting in the audience and I just thought, wow, we always hear about how animals are so great at learning, but this seems like they're actually not very good at learning. Surely, could we use machine learning to do better? Is there a way we could take our understanding of the entire field of reinforcement learning, for example, and build something that would allow us to train animals on these kinds of tasks much faster? And so that's the high-level motivation for today's talk. And I'll say, there's at least 2 reasons we might want to do that. One, it would give us new insights into how animals actually learn to perform the various tasks. And secondly, it could lead to a practical advance in that we could speed up training time, which is expensive and makes it much harder to perform neuroscience experiments in general, as the time that's devoted to training an animal on a new task. All right, so that's the high-level motivation of where I want to go with today's talk. And so let's launch into it now. So I'll talk about, first of all, the first goal that I described to you is that we need to be able to understand what is the animal's current policy, or what is its current behavior. What are the parameters governing its current behavior? All right, so to understand that, I want you to look at this diagram down here. And this is a schematic of what I have in mind, is that for a particular task that we're trying to train an animal to perform, there is some policy space, which you can think of these as the parameter space of the animal's policy. And the animal starts out at W1. This is a vector of parameters. I'm not being very specific yet about what this policy is. I'll come to that in a moment. But just think about these are parameters controlling the animal's current behavioral policy. And there is some expected reward landscape in this space. All right, so in other words, the animal starting out with W1, its initial policy is it's not getting rewarded. Typically, we might expect the animal to be performing at chance on a binary decision task like the one I just showed you. And then over the course of training, what we expect to happen is we expect the weights to evolve to near the apex of some expected reward landscape. So see up here in this darker shaded region here, the animal's getting a lot of reward per trial on average. And over the course of training the animal to perform this task, we might expect that the weights follow some meandering trajectory through this landscape that ultimately leads to successful performance of the task. All right, so the first goal here is we'd like to develop statistical methods for tracking this weight trajectory through weight space. All right, so you might imagine W1 are the weights at the beginning of the experiment of the training process, W2 or after trial 2, after trial 3, etc. After each trial, the animal has updated its policy a little bit, and we would like to be able to infer that entire trajectory from the animal's behavior. All right. So let me now make that concrete. What do we have in mind by a policy? And so we're going to start with something extremely simple. All right. So the model that we developed is called SciTrack, and it has two pieces. One of them is the observer model itself. And what we say there is that on every trial, the animal gets an input. This would be the pair of tones, stimulus A and stimulus B, in the task that I just showed you. It might also include some other regressors, like the previous choice the animal made, or the previous reward it got, or the previous stimulus that it saw in the previous trial. Basically, other things that we think might affect the animal's choice, whether or not they should affect the animal's choice, right? On this one, we'd like it to pay attention to stimulus A and B and ignore everything else. But this X of t will be a vector of inputs. Those inputs are combined with a set of psychophysical weights, WT, and they give rise to the decision, binary choice, left or right on each trial. All right, so in this case, we're going to model that decision-making process with a Bernoulli generalized linear model, or a Bernoulli GLM. This is also known as logistic regression model. What it says is that the probability of choosing right on any trial as a function, given the input vector X and the current weights, WT, on this trial, is given by a sigmoid function applied to the dot product of X of t and W, right? So we take a linear dot product between the weights and the input vector, and then we pass it through the sigmoid function, which gives us the probability of the animal choosing right on that trial, okay? So that's our model of how the animal makes its decisions. All right, so good performance would mean that the weights are positive on stimulus A and negative on stimulus B, and all the other weights should be 0. But at the beginning of training, those weights might not, was almost certainly not be correspond to those ideal weights. So that's our model of the animal's decision-making behavior on each trial. The other piece of this model would be the description of how the weights evolve across time between trial t-1 and trial t, all right? And so for this, we're going to just assume the simplest thing, again, that you could imagine, which is that the weights evolve according to a Gaussian random walk. So this is a sample from this prior. We're saying that the delta WT, the change in the weight vector at trial t, is a zero mean Gaussian vector. It has zero mean and a covariance matrix, a diagonal covariance matrix with potentially different values along the diagonal. This would allow us to have different amounts of diffusion noise in each weight. All right, so you might imagine a large value of one of these sigmas would mean that that weight evolves rapidly through time, whereas a small sigma would mean that it evolves very slowly. And the limit of sigma going all the way to 0, that would be to say that this weight doesn't change at all across time. It stays fixed for the entire training process. All right, so over here you can just see a plot of a sample set of weight trajectories sampled from this prior. Maybe we have a bias weight, a weight on stimulus 1, and another weight on stimulus 2. And so this would represent, if we just sampled from the prior, what we would get under this model. All right, and so it's worth pointing out that this is not a model that learns anything, right? This is not saying that the weights evolve toward better behavior. This is simply a prior that allows those weights some flexibility to change over time. All right, so we combine those two elements, the likelihood from the Bernoulli GLM and this dynamic Gaussian prior over the weights. And then we have the problem of now, we're going to combine those to infer the weights from the data. So what are let's talk now about that inference problem. Okay, so the inference problem is the following. We have a collection of stimuli, x1, x2. Every trial, we have a vector of inputs that the animal received. And we have the animal's binary choice, left or right, which for convenience, we can call 0s and 1s. And from this data, that's all we're going to look at, we want to infer this matrix of dynamic weights, all right? So the matrix, this is the entire set of weights that the animal had across the various input parameters in the x vector. We're assuming there are d of those, or d-dimensional input vectors x. And we'll have t trials is the number of trials. So this matrix has columns. Each column corresponds to the weights governing the animal's policy on a single trial. And each row of this matrix would show you the dynamic trajectory of a particular weight in the model. All right. And so if we look at this problem set up this way, and in fact, we want a method that scales to a very large number of trials. We often have tens to hundreds of thousands of trials in an experiment, and so we'd like to be able to infer this whole matrix from the data at the top. But there's a potential problem, which it should be obvious to those of you who think about statistical modeling, which is that this is a very ill-posed problem, right? Sorry, I'll keep this slide up here. We have our observed data consist of only t-dependent variables, right? T-binary outcome variables, and we're trying to infer a matrix of size d by t. So d times t total parameters inferred from only t observations is what's known in statistics as an ill-posed problem. There's no way we could learn this entire W matrix, and the only way the problem becomes tractable is because of the prior that allows that forces these weights to evolve slowly through time. All right. Okay. All right, so the way we're going to go about performing inference is to do what's known as maximum a posteriori inference. We're going to find the maximum of the posterior over this weight matrix W, given the collection of input vectors X and the collection of binary outcome variables Y and a vector of hyperparameters theta, which correspond here to those noise variances, which describe the prior, how fast is each weight evolving over time. This log posterior can be written as the sum of two terms. One comes from the Bernoulli log likelihoods across trials, and fortunately, this is independent across the columns of W, and then plus the Gaussian prior on each weight. Each row of this matrix has an independent Gaussian prior, and moreover, because we assume these weights are Markovian, each weight is just evolving according to the mean of the previous weight plus some Gaussian noise. The inverse covariance of this Gaussian here is tridiagonal. So even though we're gonna scale to hundreds of thousands of dimensions here, it turns out that we can find the map estimate. We can find the maximum of the sum of these two terms in linear time. All right. So this is some very nice math that Nicholas Roy, a former PhD student in my lab, developed in his Neuron 2021 paper here. All right. So we can have developed fast methods for finding the most likely set of weights given the observed data Y and this Gaussian prior. I skipped over one step though, which is of course we need to set these noise variances. And in fact, what we're going to do here is learn those from the data. We're going to do something called maximum marginal likelihood, which is to maximize the probability of the observed data Y given just the X's. That's known as the marginal likelihood or the evidence in Bayesian statistics. And that's given by the conditional probability of the outputs given the weights. Basically, it's given by this joint distribution with the weights integrated out. All right. So this is known as the marginal likelihood, and it allows us to infer how quickly each weight is evolving. You might think of this as a kind of Goldilocks problem. If we set sigma squared to 0, then we assume that the weights are constant across all time. On the other hand, if we allow these sigma squareds to be very large, that's saying we can have very rapidly fluctuating W's, which will allow us to fit the observed Y's very accurately, but it will spread out the probability mass and give us very low marginal likelihood. So we want basically to tune these sigmas to be just wide enough to allow the weights to evolve enough to explain the data, but not more. All right. And so Nick actually developed a fast method known as the decoupled Laplace approximation to compute this integral. I should say is not computable in closed form. We have a Bernoulli likelihood times a Gaussian prior. This integral can't be computed in closed form. I'm going to skip over the details for this, but see the paper if you're interested in how we do inference for these sigma squareds very rapidly. So ultimately, it's a two-step inference procedure known as empirical Bayes. We infer these sigmas from the data, and then given those sigmas, we infer the matrix of dynamic weights. Okay, so that's the theoretical setup, and I'm now going to move on to show you an application of this method to some data. Okay, so the data that we applied it to comes from the International Brain Lab. You may have heard of this before. There's a collaboration between 21 experimental and theoretical neuroscientists who have united to study a single decision-making task across the entire mouse brain. I'm just going to describe to you the task. And the task is one in which the animal views a visual stimulus. It's going to be a sinusoidal grating that appears either on the left side of the screen or the right side of the screen. And the animal's task is to detect which side of the stimulus of the screen the stimulus is on and turn a wheel in order to report its choice. So if it's on the left, the animal should turn the wheel to the right. If the stimulus appears on the right, the animal should turn the wheel to the left. All right. And an incorrect choice would be one where the animal makes the opposite wheel movement from the one that's desired. Okay, so that's the task. And for our setup here, I haven't told you yet how we define this input vector X. So in this case, we're gonna define this to be the critical ingredients of the task. So the value of the contrast of the stimulus on the left side, and I forgot to say it earlier, but we vary the task difficulty by varying this contrast from 100%. It's a very bright stimulus that you can see very easily, down to 0%, where it's actually invisible, or very low contrast values where it's a much harder task. You can barely perceive the contrast of the stimulus. Okay, so the value of the contrast of the left stimulus, the contrast of the right stimulus, these are two elements of that input vector. There's a constant which gives us a bias. In other words, if the animal has a tendency to always choose right or always choose left, this can be captured by a weight on a constant offset term. And then we'll also include some other regressors which relate to other strategies we expect that the animals may have, and empirically we observe that they do often have. They often make choices that reflect the sign of the previous stimulus. So if the animal was rewarded on the previous trial, they might make the same choice on this trial. Or if they weren't rewarded, they would switch to the opposite side. That's a strategy known as win, stay, lose, switch. And so if they have a large regressor on the stimulus of the previous side, that would give rise to that win, stay, lose, switch strategy. Animals also do something that's known as perseveration, which is they tend to repeat the previous choice whether or not it was rewarded. So we'll have another regressor, which is the previous choice, left or right, of what the animal did on the previous trial. If the animal has a large weight on that regressor, it would indicate a tendency to just repeat the same choice many trials in a row, regardless of whether they're getting rewarded. And then we might also include the animal's previous reward. Okay, so we applied the sidetrack model to a collection of data from the IBL, and I'm just showing you here the inferred weight trajectories that we got from one example mouse. And so what you'll see, first of all, is that the left stimulus is plotted in red here. The right stimulus weight is plotted in yellow. These little light gray lines here, hopefully you can see those, indicate boundaries between sessions. So the way this works is the animal starts being trained on the task. They come in the first day, they perform the task for a while. Typically, they're getting only 50% correct at the start of training. These weights are fairly close to zero at the start. And then across training, I should say, each of these, they might, on this session, there were 344 trials. And we can see here how the weights evolved during the course of that session. Across the entire plot here, of course, you're seeing nearly 5,000 trials over which the left and the right stimulus weight diverged from zero with opposite sign, which corresponds to improved performance on the task, right? So ideal performance here would be to say the right stimulus is large and positive, the left stimulus weight is large and negative, and these other weights should actually be zero for ideal performance. But in fact, we see that they're not zero here. The animal has a bias weight. This is in blue, which corresponds to a tendency to choose left or right more than indicated by the stimulus. And they also have weights on the choice history and the stimulus history indicated here in green and purple. All right, so they're far from ideal performance even at the end of training, but we can, one thing we observe already is that the bias parameter is fluctuating more rapidly than the stimulus weight. So it looks like whatever learning process or noise process is driving the bias, it is actually fluctuating more rapidly than the learning process driving these weights away from zero. And another observation about this particular animal is that at the end of training, the left stimulus weight is further from zero in a negative direction than the right stimulus weight is away from zero in a positive direction. This means that this animal will have a bit of an asymmetric behavior where they get a higher fraction correct when the stimulus is on the left than they do on the right. That's because they're more sensitive to this left contrast than they are to the right-hand side, and so they'll get more of those correct. Okay. And then there's also a non-zero dependence on choice history and stimulus history. The animal's doing some perseveration and some degree of win, stay, lose, switch, even though we would obviously, that's not ideal. That doesn't enhance their ability to get rewarded in this task. All right. And so then we can look at the animal's empirical accuracy. So this red trace here represents the animal's percent correct filtered with a Gaussian window. And you can, and the constant, the flat red lines here show the average percent correct within each session. All right, so if we focus on this session here, you can see that on average in that session, the animal got 59% correct. That's the height of this red line here, but they actually started the session near 50% correct and then drifted upwards during the session. All right, and the percent corrects up here show you the percent correct for each session. As I said earlier, the animal starts near 50% correct, and then by the end of training here is it getting 76% correct in this last session. We can use cross-validation to leave out a subset of the trials when we apply the sidetrack model, and then reconstruct the weights from those using cross-validation, and we see that the model does a good job of recapitulating this accuracy curve across time, and it also captures these fluctuations that happen within the time of a single a single session. So you might have imagined we could have just done maximum likelihood fits to the data from each session and see how those evolved, but we would be losing information about how the weights evolve on a trial-to-trial basis. They really do sometimes start low and become higher, or drop between sessions, et cetera. So that's something the model can capture for us. Let me now show you the example. Oh, we also have the bias weight. This is the animal's empirical bias, sorry, in blue here, and that represents the difference between how often the animal did go right and how often it should have gone right based on the stimuli that it was presented. And you can see that the bias is sometimes negative and sometimes positive. It ends up slightly negative at the end of training here. And the model, again, does an excellent job of recapitulating that. I'll point out one slight idiosyncrasy here. The animal is overall slightly negatively biased at the end of training here, even though the bias weight in blue here is positive. How can that be? The bias weight is positive, but the animal's behavior is slightly negatively biased toward the left. The reason for that is the factor I mentioned before. The animal's getting a higher percent correct on the left trials, whereas on the right trials, it's making a larger number of errors. So overall, even though it has a slight, on 0% contrast trials, the animal's more likely to choose right. Overall, it's more likely to make left choices because it makes a higher fraction of correct choices when the stimulus was on the left. All right, so there are subtleties that are captured by the model about the animal strategy that are not reflected simply in these accuracy and bias curves that I'm showing you at the bottom. Okay, all right. Lastly, I want to just show you a second animal that the fits from a second data from a second animal. And here what you see are, again, a left stimulus weight in red and a right stimulus weight in yellow that diverge from zero across training. Although now you'll notice something that seems perplexing. And in fact, it represents something that I haven't told you about before. We see these large jumps in the weights here. For this left stimulus weight, we're seeing large jumps at session boundaries. And so that reflects a second feature of the model that we inserted that I didn't yet mention to you, which is that we added actually a second set of hyperparameters, allowing the weights to change more between sessions than they do between adjacent trials. So the sigma squared parameter that I told you before was just how much does the weight evolve after each trial. But it would be perplexing to think that the change between the last trial of session J and the first trial of session J+1, the animal went back to the home cage, slept. Its strategy is only slightly perturbed. The size of that perturbation is the same size as between adjacent trials in the same session. Seems unlikely. So we added this other parameter, sigma trial, which allows larger amounts of noise between sessions. All right, so what that's saying is that for this animal, there was a large value of that sigma trial, which means that effectively the weights were free to change a large amount between sessions. Sigma day, on the other hand, keeps these trajectories smooth within a session. But in this animal in particular, it looks like the animal's weights are diverging away from zero. So it's getting better within a session, but then they're jumping back towards zero. So the animal's in some sense forgetting overnight. And so this represents one direction for future work. This is only one example animal, but it would be interesting to analyze systematically what happens between sessions. Do the animals usually get worse, like this animal, meaning they've forgotten? Or we know that sleep is something that can give rise to consolidation and better memory performance. So we might expect to see that in some animals that the weights would jump towards larger values further away from zero, corresponding to the animal, went home, dreamed about the task, and came back ready to perform it more accurately on a following day. All right. Okay, so last thing I'll say about this is really the work from my lab that is the gold standard, the best we've ever done in terms of reproducible science. So Nick Roy, who's was a former PhD student now at Google, Google DeepMind, wrote a software suite that you can pip install from the command line. He also released a Google Colab notebook that downloads all of the original data and refits the model from scratch and reproduces all the figures from the paper. So I encourage you to look up the code. I've talked to a lot of people who've used this, and they've said they've managed to use it without any problems. And it's given, if you're interested in tracking dynamic psychophysical behavior, SciTrack is really, I think, a very polished tool that Nick spent a lot of time perfecting and making it very accessible so that other people could use it. All right, so it's an example to the other members of my lab that I try to point to be more like Nick and make your code as friendly and as usable by others as possible. Okay, all right. So so that wraps up the first part of the talk. The second two pieces will be we discussed so far tracking psychophysical behavior across time. But as I mentioned before, this model says nothing about learning. The prior, this dynamic Gaussian prior is really only saying that the weights from trial T to T+1 evolve according to a random walk. So in general, if we simulated from the SciTrack model, we wouldn't expect improvements in performance, improvements in accuracy that we see in the animal. So what we'd like to do now is to talk about, well, can we go further and break down these changes in weights between trials into a deterministic component that perhaps comes from a learning rule, maybe some learning rule that we know from reinforcement learning, and a noise component. So whereas before we treated all of these as resulting from Gaussian noise, we now want to break them down into one component that comes from a learning rule, which we can infer from data, and then maybe the residual error will, the amount of noise that we have to attribute to that weight change can be reduced. All right. And so we have several publications about this, including some ongoing work from a PhD student, Victor Giada, who's in my lab currently. Let me set let me describe the high-level outline of what the work is. So now what we have, between trial T-1, we have the stimulus, the animal's weights, and the animal's choice. We're going to say that there's a learning rule which caused some systematic change in WT between this trial, based on whether the animal was rewarded or not, and the weights on the subsequent trial. So in other words, the psychometric curve, in virtue of that weight change, will have shifted maybe slightly to the left or right, or maybe it will have gotten slightly steeper due to some learning rule, which I'll describe to you in a moment. Okay, specifically, we're going to use a rule. So the weights, this delta W will be the weight change between trial T-1 and trial T. We're going to try to break that down into a deterministic rule that comes from a learning rule. In particular, we're going to use a rule known as policy gradient. What this says is that the animal should adjust the weights in a direction that maximize the change in the expected reward. This is the expected reward given the current weights. And so this is the gradient of that expected reward with respect to the weights. And we want to move a small direction uphill in that expected reward landscape governed by some learning rate alpha. All right, so this is the component that comes from a learning rule, and then we're going to say that there's also some amount of noise in those weights, just like before. And so there'll also be a noise component governed by some standard deviation sigma. So this rightmost component here, the noise component, is identical to what we had previously in sidetrack, but now we're saying that that's only one of the things that's affecting the change in the weights. It's also it's being summed with this deterministic learning rule. Okay, so policy gradient. One way of computing the policy gradient learning rule is with a method called reinforce. This is introduced in a very old paper from Williams, 1992. And if you work through the math of the expected the policy gradient learning rule, it turns out that it turns out to be the gradient of the log probability of the animal's choice given the stimulus times their reward times this learning rate. All right. So in a paper with Nick Roy and Zoe Ashwood, we assumed that the animal was using this reinforced learning rule, and then we looked at some data from the IBL and inferred the weight changes that occurred over time using now just two weights, one stimulus weight and a bias weight. And then this method allows us to break those stimulus weights and bias weights down into noise and signal components. And what you can see is that when we did that with this basic reinforced learning rule, we get the deterministic learning components are these solid traces here, and the noise components are these dashed lines here. So we're saying that a fairly large amount of the total weight change came from the noise component. Right, you can see that the stimulus weight is gradually evolving away from zero, and the bias weight is fluctuating noisily around zero. We then took a further step and said, well, there are fancier versions of the policy gradient learning rule. Another rule introduced by Williams was what he called reinforced with baseline, where you say that there's an offset to this reward. Maybe that's the animal's internal set point of rewards above some certain amount, above beta, are reinforcing, and rewards below that amount are effectively punishments. And we could have different baselines for each parameter in our model, and as well as different learning rates. There's no reason to assume that the learning rate of the bias weight is the same as the learning rate of the stimulus weight. So we extended our approach to this more flexible learning rule, and we applied the same technique of inferring these time-varying weights from behavior. And it turns out that now when we break down, so these are the net stimulus weights and the net bias weights, under this learning rule, when we break them down into signal and noise, I'm showing you these now in separate plots, it turns out that we can explain almost the entire trajectory of these learning weights in terms of the learning rule. And the noise component is very close to zero. It looks like zero in these traces. It's not actually. But so this is, I thought, quite a surprising finding. It says that this idiosyncratic bias weight that seems to fluctuate sometimes positive, sometimes negatively, is not the result of stochasticity in the animal's behavior. It really can be attributed to systematic changes in that bias parameter that were driven by learning. All right, under this richer learning rule. So this is published in a NeurIPS paper that we published in 2020, and Victor Giada is working on extending this now to a larger data set and testing out a larger family of learning rules. The takeaway is that most of the weights under this learning rule can be attributed to learning, and we're now extending this to look at other classes of learning rules as well as richer models of the animal's policy. Okay, so that'll wrap up that second component. Just as a proof of concept that we can infer learning rules governing behavior, I should say the rules we've considered so far are quite simple, and so we actually expect that when we look at richer families of learning rules, we may find even better descriptions of the animal's behavior. Okay, so now let's move on to the third part, which is that if we know what the animal's learning rule is, and we know the current state of their knowledge, can we develop adaptive training methods that allow us to select the stimulus to optimally drive some behavior, drive the animal's behavior towards some desired state? In other words, I said to you that in current training protocols, the animal's behavior took this meandering path upwards toward the apex of this expected reward landscape. What we would like to do instead is, would there be a way to select stimuli optimally to drive the animal straight uphill so that it got to this apex where it's performing the task with high accuracy much faster than with our current training protocols? How could we do that? And so for this, this is some work carried out by Ji-Hun Bak, who was then a PhD student in my lab with Bill Bialik. She's now moved on to a postdoctoral position at UC Berkeley. And she came up with a rule that she called align max. And this is a very simple idea. I'll give you the basic intuition here. The key idea is that we're going to choose this stimulus on trial T that drives the expected weight change towards some goal weights. So think of the goal weights as the weights that would maximize percent correct. So in our case of this IBL task, it would mean a large positive weight on the right stimulus, a large negative weight on the left stimulus, zero bias weight, and zero weights on all of those other regressors like previous stimulus and previous choice. All right, so that's our goal weight. And we have x of t would be our current weights. What we're going to try to do is to select a stimulus that maximizes the amount of weight change that we get in the direction of those goal weights. All right, so this we're going to try to maximize the dot product between this term is our expected weight change if we present stimulus x. All right, so we can consider different possible stimuli we could present. Under each of those, we have the animal's learning rule that would allow us to predict how large a weight change will we get if we present stimulus 1 versus stimulus 2 versus stimulus 3. We have some discrete set of stimuli we could present. For each of those, we consider how much weight change do we get, right? That's the average weight change that we would expect if we present stimulus x. And we want to maximize the dot product between that weight vector, delta weight vector, and the direction we want to go. So this is our bracket WT would be the mean of our posterior over the current weights. So using our inference procedure, we can guess, we can infer what the animal's current weights are, and this is the error vector between where the current weights are and our goal weights. So effectively, we're saying if we want to go in this direction, choose the weights that maximize the amount of distance traveled in that direction. Okay, so that's the align max learning rule that Ji-Hun developed, and I now want to show you we applied that. The good news is that it works really well in training simulated rats. Unfortunately, we don't yet have results on actual rats. That's something I'll talk about in a second. But let me just show you now some results when we applied the align max training rule to simulated rats. So first of all, it does something that I found kind of surprising. Maybe it's obvious in hindsight, but we applied this to a simulated rat where the animal started with weights that were far from good performance. And so what you can see here is the stimulus strength of the this is again the IBL task. So there is a large positive stimulus or a large negative stimulus. This would be a bright contrast, high contrast stimulus on the right or a high contrast stimulus on the left. And as a function of the number of trials into training. And so what you see is these initial stimuli are very far from zero. So they're effectively very high contrast stimuli on the left or on the right. And then over the course of training, the contrasts are coming down towards zero. So in other words, we're starting with very easy stimuli that are easy to see, very salient. And then as the animal's performance gets better, the stimuli become closer to this decision boundary of zero. So effectively, this accords with our intuition that if you're training someone to perform a new task, give them some easy examples to start with, and then make it harder over time to improve their performance. That's the best thing to do to accelerate their performance, but that's something that came out for free from this align max training algorithm. Okay, here we can see when you select those stimuli, these are the temporal evolution of weights on stimulus 1 versus stimulus 2. The solid traces here show under our align max training policy. The dashed trace here shows you if instead you just randomly selected stimuli. So you can see these weights evolve, they diverge from zero more But even more impressively, I would say, so the weights diverge more rapidly from zero. Even more impressive is what happens to the bias weight and if we have a history weight, let's say on the previous choice. Here we initialize the simulated rat with a negative bias weight of -1. This means initially the animal's making mostly left choices, and a positive history weight, meaning that the animal tends to perseverate and repeat its previous choice with a high probability. And what you see here is that the dash traces show that under random training, you select the stimulus on each trial randomly from a training set. These biases and perseveration effects only very gradually, these weights very gradually converge back to zero. Under optimal training, however, they much more rapidly converge to zero. What this says is that the algorithm is giving us a form of automatic debiasing, an automatic suppression of the policy of perseveration. So it's encouraging the animal. If the animal's currently biased to one side, it's showing more stimuli in a way that would drive the animal to reduce that bias. Or if it tends to repeat choices many times in a row, it's maybe showing more stimuli that alternate sides more rapidly than you would get by chance to teach the animal not to have a perseveration strategy. All right, so we get this automatic biasing as well, and the history and the bias parameters are eliminated more rapidly than we would under random training. Okay, so that's all well and good, but you might reasonably say, I'm not that impressed that you can train simulated rats. The simulated rat was in fact using the policy gradient learning rule that we discussed, that we simulated the animal as using this exact analytic a learning rule that I described in the previous part of the talk. The next step is to try this out on real animals. And so this is a next step that I'm very excited about. My colleague at Princeton, Carlos Brody, has a setup known as the Rat Factory. He has 30 boxes that will train animals around the clock. And so it's really a training facility that allows you to train animals and record from them at a very high volume. And so Carlos has very generously agreed to collaborate with us on trying out some of our adaptive training protocol methods in some of his rats. And so that's something I have a current postdoc who's working on. And we're not highly confident that our current training method will yield big improvements, but it's something that we think with iteration, if we get better models of animals' learning behavior and maybe try out different theories of shaping that may be necessary to get us faster training. But being able to sort of try this out on real animals is a next step that I'm very excited about. Okay, so that's the end of the main content. This work that started with tracking animals' weights, inferring their learning rules, and then developing methods for adaptive stimulus selection for improved training. I want to now give you just a quick 3-minute discussion of one additional topic, which is that of discrete internal states. So far, the models that I described to you assume that the animal has a policy governed by this weight vector W, and on each trial, the stimulus comes in, there's a dot product with that weight vector W, and the animal makes its choice. And in a related, a sort of separate set of papers, we've discovered that animals actually don't behave like that. They actually have internal discrete states that mean that they alternate between different strategies on a trial-to-trial basis. So they don't only have these weights that evolve slowly through time, they also seem to alternate between different forms of strategies, often corresponding to engagement or disengagement on a trial-to-trial basis. So the question I'll pose to you is, can we incorporate discrete internal states into our model of animal behavior? So you might imagine that on trial t-1, the animal's in state 1. Again, on trial t, it's in state 1. But then when on trial t+1, the animal jumps into state 2, some different weight vector entirely, or some different policy entirely that gives rise to a different mapping from inputs to outputs. Okay, so the motivation for this work actually originally was not about learning or tracking animals' behavior through time. It was motivated by this other observation that animals, in particular rodents, seem to lapse at very high rates. So this is a psychometric curve for an example animal from the IBL. What I'm plotting here is on the x-axis is the contrast of the stimulus. So -100 would be a 100% contrast stimulus on the left, +100 is 100% contrast stimulus on the right, and this is the animal's probability of a rightward choice as a function of that stimulus. And what you should expect, I would think, would be is that when the stimulus is very, very high contrast, and the animal is already trained, it can get the task perfect. It can get 100% correct on those trials. And that's not what we observe. Typically, the animals make errors at a rate of 10 to 20%, even on the very easiest trials. Why is that, right? It would be very perplexing to you if I showed an undergraduate in one of my classes, here's a stimulus, a very bright stimulus on the right-hand side of the screen. How many of you see it on the right? And only 90% of the students in the class raise their hand. If 10% seem to think it's on the left, we would think that's very puzzling. So what's going on? Why is it that animals make these, rodents in particular, make these lapses at such a high rate? And our hypothesis was that maybe this isn't really the inability to perform the task at high accuracy. Maybe it reflects some alternation between different states, maybe an engaged state and a disengaged state. So the model that we developed to try to fit to that data, to make that that idea concrete, is a model known as the GLM-HMM. This is a hidden Markov model with Bernoulli generalized linear model observations. And I'm going to give you a quick description of the model and show you some very cursory results, and then I'll wrap up. So the GLM-HMM itself is a hidden Markov model with discrete internal states, right? So here we have just two states, state 1 and state 2, and there's a transition probability A12, which gives us the probability if I'm in state 1 on trial T, what is the probability of transitioning into state 2 on the next trial? And 1 minus that probability would be the probability of remaining in state 1. Typically, we expect these models to have a stickiness such that if you're in a particular state, you stay in that state for many trials in a row before switching. So we expect these transition probabilities to be fairly low. And then A21 would be the probability if I'm already in state 2 of switching back to state 1. Okay, so those are the states. That's the underlying hidden Markov model. Each of those states is associated with a different Bernoulli GLM. So each of those states has a different weight vector describing the mapping from inputs to outputs. So from that, you would get perhaps very different psychometric functions. Here we can imagine that state 1 is an engaged state where there's a large sensory stimulus weight and the animal has this very steep psychometric curve, whereas in state 2, the animal has a much shallower psychometric curve. It's relatively disengaged. It's not paying very close attention to the stimulus. Okay, this model family is one I should say we developed earlier in collaboration with Mala Murthy and Adam Calhoun to describe fly courtship behavior. This work represented an application to rodent decision making. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the results very quickly from a recent paper from Zoe Ashwood. Zoe found that a 3-state model actually gave an excellent fit to mouse behavior. So what I'm showing you here are, first of all, the transition matrix. This is a function if you're in state 1, 2, or 3 at trial T. Each row gives you the probability of switching to another state. All right, so if I'm in state 1 at trial T, I have probability 0.98 of remaining in state 1. Similarly, I have a probability, if I'm in state 2, 0.95 is my probability of remaining in state 2. And if I'm in state 3, I have a probability 0.96 of transitioning, remaining in state 3. These off-diagonal probabilities would be the probabilities of switching states from one state to another. All right, so that's the inferred transition matrix that we got from the data. It tells us that these animals are indeed tending to remain in one state for multiple trials in a row. What do those states themselves look like? So for that, we can look at the GLM weights that we extracted from each state, and we found that state 1 had a large weight on the stimulus contrast. This is the difference between the right and the left contrast, very effectively zero bias, and no weight on the previous choice. In fact, instead of looking at these GLM weights, it's easier to look at the corresponding psychometric curves. So state 1 with this large stimulus weight has a very steep psychometric curve in which the animal's getting nearly 100% correct on these easy trials that I just told you about a moment ago. On the other hand, these other two states, state 2 and state 3, look like states with large left and right biases respectively. So this negative bias here in state 2 gives rise to a leftward bias in the psychometric curve. The animal's making almost entirely left choices here. And in state 3, it's also shallower. I should say both of these curves are shallower because there's a smaller weight on the stimulus, and this positive weight here shifts the psychometric curve so the animal's making almost all rightward choices. It's also perseverating a bit more than it did in the engaged state. All right, so this gives us a different picture of animal decision making than we had from the model I showed you before. It says that the animal's not just slowly evolving its weights through time, it's switching between an engaged state and these disengaged states. And overall, what this model is telling us is that that psychometric curve that we observed, where we still on these 100% contrast trials are not getting the task right on every trial, is not the result of some inability to do the task well. That would reflect an averaging of these different psychometric curves. If the animal's in state 1, yes, it gets those easy trials correct, but sometimes the animal's in these other bias states where it's only getting 50% correct on those easiest rightward trials. Okay. So this net psychometric curve that we extract from the entire data set is explainable as a mixture of these different states. And I should say this is work that was fit only to the data collected after the animal was fully trained. So we have, let me finish this story and then I'll make a segue to the previous work. The other thing that we can do with this model is once we have it fit, we can now go back and look at a particular session and ask what state was the animal in on different trials. All right, so here's an example session of 90 trials from 2019. And what we see is that on this session, the animal started out in state 1, the engaged state that I'm showing you over here, and then toward the end of the session, it transitioned into the biased left state. But we see different behaviors on different dates, right? Here's one where it again starts in the engaged state and then switches between the two biased left and biased right states near the end. This other session is one where in the middle of the session, it jumps into one of the biased states and then jumps back to the engaged state. So we see idiosyncrasies in how often the animal is in different states, but this also gives us a powerful tool for analyzing our data post hoc. Perhaps you're only interested in the behavior while the animal was in the engaged state. It was doing the task really to the best of its ability. You could use this as a way to simply select data from when the animal was in state 1, the engaged state, and throw away the data from the other states. Or you might be interested in investigating neural circuits that correspond to state switching or that correspond to the strategies that the animals are using in different states. Okay, so I think of this as a very nice lens for getting more insight into what the animal's doing on a trial-to-trial basis. It's not simply performing according to that average psychometric curve. It may be doing something very different in one trial versus another. Okay, that was only data from one example mouse. I just want to show you that when we fit to a population of 29 mice, we got remarkably consistent states. These are the state 1 engaged state weights, which all have a large stimulus weight, and these other two biased states look very consistent across mice. The dwell times, which are given by that hidden Markov model transition matrix, averaged around 25 trials in a row for the engaged state. So once the animal becomes engaged, it tends to remain there for a while, which is encouraging if indeed we want to select those times when the animal's most engaged. Last thing I'll say, all of this work on hidden Markov models was applied only to fully trained animals, whereas the stuff about training, we only applied to the training data when the animal started out and evolved towards good performance of the task. And so that naturally raises a question, well, what's happening during the training process? Are these discrete states also present from the beginning of training, or do they only emerge at the end of the training procedure? All right, and so to address that, a former undergraduate student in my lab, Lenka Kucherella, who's now a PhD student at Columbia, developed a synthesis of these two models that she called the dynamic GLM-HMM. And this model essentially combines the sidetrack model, where the weights can evolve from across time, with the hidden Markov model, where there are multiple states, each state with its own GLM weights. And what she found when she applied this model to data, this is the inferred weights that she got averaged across a whole suite of animals. She found that, again, a 3-state model gave an excellent description of the data, and this is the stimulus weight as a function of the session number. What we see is that there's an engaged state with a larger stimulus weight, but the stimulus weights from all 3 states are getting larger as a function of time, and there's a left biased, an unbiased, and a right biased state, all of which are slightly becoming more biased, or I should say they relatively maintain their relative biases across training. Most significantly, she asked, when is it that we can reliably say that a 3-state model is a better description of the data than a 1-state model? And she found that for all animals, within the first 3 sessions of training, so the animal at session 1 is naive, has never seen the task before, by session 3, all of the animals are better described by this alternating 3-state model, saying that really these discrete states emerge very early in training. So the discrete states emerge early in the training process. The stimulus weights increase in nearly all the states, and they do spend more time in the engaged state as training advances. All right, so this is one direction for future work that we would also like to integrate with our inference of learning rules and our adaptive training procedures, which of course take no account of discrete states, but I think it's an exciting direction that we'd like to go in next. So with that, I'll just wrap up. I've discussed the sidetrack model, a dynamic Bernoulli GLM for tracking behavior. We've inferred learning rules from training data and described an adaptive stimulus selection method for optimizing training. Lastly, I told you briefly about this hidden Markov model with switching between multiple internal states, and we're excited about investigating the neural underpinnings of these learning rules and states and applying it to real animal data to ask if we can improve animal training. With that, I'd just like to thank all of the wonderful students and postdocs who are associated with this work, as well as my faculty collaborators at Princeton and elsewhere, and my funding sources. And with that, I'd like to stop, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks so much.